You are listening to the Thoughts from a Page podcast, which is a member of the Evergreen Podcasts Network. My name is Cindy Burnett, and I love to talk about books with anyone and everyone. While listening to my podcast, you will hear author interviews, behind-the-scenes conversations about various aspects of the publishing world, theme discussions with other book lovers, and more. For more book recommendations and a complete list of all of my interviews, check out my website, thoughtsfromapage.com, and follow me on Facebook and Instagram at Thoughts From a Page. In 2022, I would love for you to join my Patreon group. I offer at least 2 bonus episodes a month and a monthly advanced read and pre-publication author chat. For those on Facebook, I host a special Patreon Facebook group where we all chat books. Thanks so much to those who already participate, and I hope you will consider joining us. Today, I am chatting with Landis Wade about deadly declarations. Landis is a recovering trial lawyer and host of the popular Charlotte Readers podcast, where he has conducted more than 300 author interviews. His third book, The Christmas Redemption, won the holiday category of the 12th Annual National Indie Excellence Awards. He lives in Charlotte, Durham, and Watauga County, North Carolina, where he writes and podcasts, visits his grandchild, and fly fishes. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Before I get started with my interview with Landis, I want to highlight another podcast that I enjoy listening to, the Book Club Babes. Here's a little more information, and I hope you'll check it out.
Hi, we're the Book Club Babes. I'm Chantel.
And I'm Kate. And together, along with our online community, we choose and read one book each month.
Some of the books we've read together include Firekeeper's Daughter, The Rose Code, Beartown, and more. That's my fiance!
Oh my God! And he says he'll talk for a fish burger and fries, which I was like, yeah.
Do you want a ring?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, bye.
Okay, bye. And I was like, no.
And she was like, no.
And now they want her to cook the meth. If you'd like to join us, please search for bookclubbabes.pod on Instagram, look for our private discussion group on Facebook, or check us out online at bookclubbabes.ca.
And find us every Thursday wherever you pod.
Bye!
Welcome, Landis. How are you today?
I am doing great, Cindy, and I am so happy to be here.
I am so happy that you're here as well because I got to guest on your podcast in December, and so I'm so happy that you're now guesting on mine.
Yeah, it's great when we can do those home and away podcasts and have a good time.
Absolutely. So you're the host of the Charlotte Readers podcast, for those that aren't aware of that yet. And I really enjoy listening to your interviews. And you initially focused on Charlotte and North Carolina authors, but you now branched out a little bit. And so sometimes they're local and sometimes they're not. Is that correct?
That's right. I started local, and then, as you know, in this thing called podcasting, when people find out about you, they contact you. And that's great because now I've interviewed authors in 28 or 30 states in 4 countries. So it's really fun to interview authors from other locations and find out about where they write, how they write, and everything that goes with it.
Absolutely. And I'm sure it's nice to focus locally because people love that, to hear what's around them and who's writing. But then it's also fun with COVID, where people were branching out, to be able to reach people elsewhere as well.
Yeah, it really was amazing to me. You know, the pandemic's been a terrible, terrible thing for the country, but in some respects, it's taught us new tricks, right? We've had to learn how to use the internet to do different things, both as authors and as podcasters. And, it's kind of opened up this world of being able to talk to authors from all over the place.
I agree. And I agree it's a terrible thing, but I do think there have been some silver linings, and that people are communicating digitally so much better than they ever did prior to the pandemic. And we've all learned to use different platforms and be able to communicate better that way.
Absolutely. And, it's when I started podcasting, I didn't know the difference between a mixer and a mixing bowl. And my wife said I didn't know what a mixing bowl was either. But anyway, and so learning this new technology is just fun. It's kind of a challenge. And, they're always coming out with new ways to spice up a podcast. And, we can drop in interviews, we can drop in music. You're doing this, it's fun to experiment.
It really is. And it's fun to just talk to a wide range of people.
Yeah, and that's what I've done, and I know that you do the same thing on your podcast, is I'm not tied to one particular genre. I might read sometimes if I'm on the beach or listening to something, maybe more mysteries, thrillers, some nonfiction that I like. But in the podcast, I've done all genres, and it's kind of opened me up a little bit, to different styles of writing that I might not have picked up off the shelf were I not doing the podcast.
I agree with that completely. I have read books that I'm not sure I would have even known about initially or thought, oh, that sounds like my type of book because of the podcast, and I've loved it.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
So you're here today to talk about your new book, Deadly Declarations. I thought it was so interesting. I love books that look at events in history or issues in history that I'm not as familiar with, which I wasn't at all for this one. And I think other people may be the same way. So you focus on the Mecklenberg Declaration of Independence. Before we start, I thought you might talk about the Mecklenberg Declaration of Independence, the mystery surrounding it, and the potential connection to Thomas Jefferson, so people will have some context, and then we can dive into your book. Does that sound good?
Yes, that sounds great. And thank you for reading the book, and I'm really glad you liked it. You never know going into the to these things where the people will connect with the book. But yeah, so as I say in my author's note in the book, the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence has been kind of an enigma for over 250 years. Oral history tells us that the Meck Dec was signed in the turbulent wake of British hostilities at Lexington and Concord when a group of prominent Mecklenburg County citizens, it wasn't a very big place at the time. I mean, George Washington, I think, called it a trifling place in his diary. So, maybe 1,000 people, but the militia leaders came together and they were meeting in Charlotte, then called Charlottetown, on May 19th to discuss the state of affairs in the colonies when an express rider came through and reported on the news that had happened on April 19th, 1775, just about a month earlier. It took that long for the news. We didn't have the internet then, so it took a while for the news to get there. And when the news arrived, the citizens of Charlotte were incensed. They debated whether they should stay connected to Great Britain. And after some pretty long debates that followed some sworn oaths that they'd given during the Regulator conflict, they came down on the side of independence, as the story goes. And they declared their independence from the most powerful nation in the world, basically that put their lives and property at risk. And so over the years, historians have kind of treated the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence with this sort of disdain. Running the gamut from contempt to indifference. And many have called it fake, and others borrowed the words from Thomas Jefferson. You mentioned him. He called the document spurious, but then again, John Adams, who found out about it in the early 1800s, said it was the greatest curiosity and deepest mystery that ever occurred to him, and actually accused Thomas Jefferson of plagiarizing from the Meck Dec because there is similar language in the two documents. So the question became, who copied from whom if the document was real. And interesting thing is that the date, May 20th, 1775, is on the North Carolina state flag. It's also, people wonder what our license plate is about when it says First in Freedom. Well, that's sort of where it comes from. And you have this issue of whether it happened or didn't happen because the documents burned up in a fire in around 1800. The secretary, John McNitt Alexander, all those documents went up in smoke. His house, he left behind some notes of the meeting, and there was a lot of oral history that went along with it. But oral history is not always strong enough for historians. And basically, the Virginians and the Massachusetts folks and people from Philadelphia said, well, this is just North Carolina trying to get a little more publicity for their role in the Revolutionary War, and it's not true at all. And then in North Carolina, it was celebrated every year with parades. They had a 100th anniversary, and in the 20th century, 5 presidents came to Charlotte to celebrate the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence.
So there really are 2 issues surrounding the Meck Dec. The first is whether it existed at all. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
And then one is whether Thomas Jefferson saw it and used any of that language to create what we now know as the Declaration of Independence.
Right. And the reason that that idea got started about Thomas Jefferson is that, there are different phrases in the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence that are very similar to what's in the Declaration of Independence. Our lives, our property, and all that kind of thing. We pledge our lives, property, et cetera. And, some would say, well, that's just the way people talked at the time, so it wasn't really plagiarism. But it happened 1 year before the Declaration of Independence. And there is evidence that a express rider named Captain Jack road documents that had come out of that meeting in Charlotte to Philadelphia, a 500-mile trip. It's documented in several journals along the way. The Moravians in Winston-Salem documented an express rider coming through that talked about independence being declared in Mecklenburg. And, he went to Philadelphia and he met with the delegates from North Carolina, and they said, "Thank you very much for your patriotism, but these actions are premature." And interestingly, those three men never wrote about this in their journals, almost as if they were trying to keep it a secret. And some believe they're trying to keep it a secret because at that point in time, they were still negotiating with England. It was in the summer of 1775, they had something called the Olive Branch Petition that went over to England that's really kind of chastised Parliament, but said, "We'll stick with you, King George," kind of thing. They wanted Parliament to change things they were doing. It was sort of the last gasp. Some believe they didn't want to disrupt that process by starting to talk about independence. But John Adams, when he wrote his letter to Thomas Jefferson in 1800, said, "You know as well as I know that if I had known about the Meck the halls of Congress would have echoed and re-echoed with that sentiment from the great citizens of Mecklenburg."
Well, I appreciate your giving us a little background because I just think it helps as we begin to talk about your story. So now, why don't you tell us a little bit more about Deadly Declarations?
Yeah, so when I was writing this mystery, I was started out wanting to explore life in a retirement community. And I write these lighthearted legal thrillers because I'm a recovering trial lawyer. I tried cases for 35 years, civil cases, not criminal cases. But, I've been to court a lot. I've done a lot of depositions. So I know a lot about what goes on in the courtroom. But I enjoy also, humor in fiction. And so I've written these lighthearted legal thrillers. I wrote a Christmas courtroom trilogy, kind of a cross between My Cousin Vinny and Miracle on 34th Street. But I wanted to dive deeper into history. I was a history major in college, and I thought I want to dive into, Charlotte history, which is kind of how I got into the Meck. But before it was even the Meck story, it was basically retirees in a retirement community facing a mysterious death. One of the residents, who's 96-year-old, dies, and when they find his body, his manuscript on the Mecklenberg Declaration of Independence is missing, and he's left a handwritten will for his $50 million estate to the most despised resident at the Indy, Sue Ellen Parker. And he's cut his beloved granddaughter, his only heir, out of his will. And so what you have is these three retirees that come together under kind of odd circumstances. The protagonist is a fellow named Craig Travail. He's a lawyer who gets kicked out of his AmLaw 100 law firm and finds himself in a retirement community. He's lost his wife. He doesn't really think much of living in a retirement community. He thinks it's more about dying than living. And he sees this as, he's very depressed and so forth. And he meets a kind of an optimistic soul named Chuck Yeager Alexander, who loves historical conspiracies and shoots trout with his gun in a pond. and then along comes Harriet Keaton. She's a former businesswoman. She really doesn't like Sue Ellen Parker. She's the kind of glue that keeps the men in line in this triumvirate here. And, they convince Craig DeVale at his reluctance to challenge the will in court for Lori, the granddaughter. And when they do that, they find out that someone doesn't want the secret of the Meck to come out. And the more they learn, the more danger they put themselves in. And the question is, will they be able to solve a mystery that nobody has been able to solve in 250 years?
I just can't even imagine the amount of research you must have had to do. I opened your book and started reading, and pretty early on, there's a letter between Adams and Jefferson. So I had to flip to the back to see if you mentioned whether that was a real letter or not. And it is real. You've edited it down a little bit, but you use their actual correspondence, which I loved. And by the way, thank you for the author's note, because I think it's really helpful as a reader to go and understand at the end, okay, this really happened, or this is what you added to the story. I always really appreciate that. But you must have just had so much research to do, and it must have been hard to consolidate it down to get it into the book.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I did enjoy putting the afterword in the book because whenever I read historical fiction, I want to know what's true and what's imagination. And so I'm always Googling, or I'm used to be before we had the internet, I went to the encyclopedia to look it up to find out what was true. So I tried to keep as much truth in the story as I could and take it as far as I could before I jumped off with my imagination. And you're right, there was a lot of research to do, but fortunately, a fellow lawyer in Charlotte named Scott Seifert had written a nonfiction book on the Mech deck, and I had him on my podcast. And so that's how I got interested in the story. And I said, Scott, hey, are you going to write this novel? He said, no, you write it. And I said, all right, well, if I write it, will you look over what I do and make sure I don't screw up the facts? He said, sure. And I had his book, and then he had a lot of citations in there. So I started looking at what he'd written and what others had written. And you're right, Cindy, it was way too long in those first 2 or 3 or 4 drafts of the book. It was over 120,000 words. And, the feedback I was getting was that, look, there's a lot of good history in here, but to keep the pace up in the book, you've got to cut a lot of this out. So I tried to come up with some techniques to do that, such as creating letters, transcripts, other things that I could drop in along the way that didn't have to be part of the narrative itself. And I took some of the history and put it in the afterward.
Well, I do think you probably come across so many fascinating facts, and you're thinking, I want people to know this and I want people to know that. And so then by the time you're done, you're like, okay, there's too many fascinating facts in here. I've got to pull it back a little bit. But I can see it's got to be really tough. And I'm sure there were so many rabbit holes you went down. I mean, this is a fascinating topic. And there's probably so many tangential stories or facts or events that you're thinking, oh, wait a minute, I want to learn more about that. And so to rein yourself back in, I think was probably pretty hard.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many controversies surrounding the Mech deck. I was trying to figure out which one do I choose. I mean, there have been, over the course of time, 2 or 3 forgeries of the Mech deck that people tried to pass off, even in the 20th century, to people in Charlotte who would pay a large sum to have the actual document. So I could have gone that route. There were other routes I could have gone. I chose one. I won't get into, exactly what I did. You have to read the book to figure that out. But basically the plot line that I choose is sort of a real cliffhanger in the real world, and I just decided to let my characters take it a bit further to solve the mystery.
Well, that's fun, and I definitely enjoyed the story. And it made me go down my own rabbit holes of Googling different things about it all.
Yeah, and you can do that. It's hard not to. I mean, when I read the letters from Jefferson to Adams and Adams back to Jefferson, and Jefferson's calling it spurious and apocryphal gospel, and Adams is accusing him of plagiarism, I said, this is too good to pass up for a novel. I'm amazed that nobody's written it yet.
Absolutely. That was my thought as well.
Yeah.
What was the hardest part about writing the book?
I think the hardest part about writing the book was trying to run a podcast while I was writing the book, frankly. And you know what I'm talking about, right?
I do. It is. I always say this. It is so much more time consuming than I ever dreamt it would be. I love it, but it's a lot of work.
Exactly. But apart from that, when I did, finally carve out some time, I think it was, finding the focus for the book. And once I decided that I was going to put the Mech deck on trial in the Mecklenburg County Courthouse, that allowed me a mechanism to bring out the facts about the Mech deck on both sides in kind of a fun way, because, you got a fact finder, you got the jury. And the way I did it was by, bringing the will contest into play. Craig Tervail comes up with this theory. He thinks, hey, if I can prove that this guy was off his rocker, so to speak, he didn't have testimonial capacity, we can overturn this will. What better way to do that than to show that he changed his mind about the Mech deck but didn't have anything to support it. And so he goes into court thinking, well, I'll just show all the flaws in the story about the Mech deck. And the other side, of course, wants to build up the story of the Mech deck. So that was a great environment for me to try to have the pros and cons of the Mech deck story.
Well, and you talk about writing around the podcast. Do you have a set time? Did you block off days? Did you take a break from the podcast? How did that work?
Yeah, so once I had focused in on the Mech deck and I was at about 30,000 words at, I think it was the end of 2020, I took 3 weeks and went to my cabin in the mountains, and I'd already pre-recorded a lot of podcasts, and I just basically wrote for 3 weeks and wrote another 70,000 words, and then I came home and wrote for another 2 weeks between podcasting and got up to about 120,000 words. And that really helped me. I'm sort of a binge writer in that respect. If I'm going to get the sequel out or the next in the series out in a year, I'm going to have to maybe change the way I do things. But I can't really write every day unless I know that I've got a path forward. And once I knew that path forward, it became very easy for me to focus.
So once you kind of decided how to narrow the story, how you were going to tell it, then it's easy to sit down and actually write it.
Yeah, I think so. And I also think that if you don't have something you're writing about that you're passionate about, it will slow your writing down. If you're just saying, I'm just going to show up every morning and write 1,000 words, but you're not really excited about it, then it's not going to go anywhere. And so early in the process, when I was writing this mystery about death in retirement community, I wasn't as excited about it as I was once I figured out that, hey, the Mech deck is going to be a part of this plot line too. And that really, gave me the juice to want to write the story.
You needed a hook.
Exactly.
Well, you interview podcast guests regularly, authors mainly. Have you learned a lot from them that's influenced your writing?
Absolutely. I have learned so much from the authors that I've interviewed. When I was in my middle 50s and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do in my 60s as having been a lawyer all my life, I decided I really like writing about conflict better than experiencing it on a daily basis. So
I get that.
Yeah, and I wrote a few books, but they weren't, I was kind of writing my way into them. Going from writing legal briefs and nasty letters to other lawyers and letters to clients, it's a lot different than the kind of writing you do in fiction. So I was learning in those first 3 books. And I decided when I started the podcast, I really want to learn more about writing a novel. And the way I learned was by reading, over 300 books in the last 3 years and interviewing those more than 300 authors about how they do what they do. So I learned things like, developing a structure, the 3 or 4 act structure, about how character is more important than plot, about how to start in the middle of the action, start at the exciting point. And if you got some backstory you need to drop it in later, but always make sure that the scenes and the next chapters are moving the story forward. Keep that pace moving. And then I just had to basically recognize that no matter how much better I felt like I was getting in writing each book, every book requires rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. And I follow what my editor's mantra is, which is add, subtract, reorder, and clarify.
I think it's really interesting when I interview authors to hear them talk about the process and, how they sit down to write, how they block out their time frame, whatever it's going to be, the actual process of writing. But also, I think it's really interesting to hear about once you have that initial draft and how much effort it is to get the initial draft to the book that's published.
Yeah, I don't think people realize how much work goes into a book after you write the end. I mean, the end is just the beginning for the most part. If you want it to be something that kind of moves and that has, it has interesting characters, has a good plot, but also has an underlying theme that comes out in the book. These are all things that take some time and some reflection. And I think authors sometimes, myself included, you kind of need to get away from the manuscript sometimes, because I've probably read this book, 100, 200 times or more. And, I find something every time I read it that I could improve on. At some point, you've got to say, stop, stop the madness here. Let's get this thing out. But it does take a while to kind of bring out all of the sensory experiences that need to be there in a novel that might not be there on the first 2 or 3 drafts. And also you got some kinks to work out in the plot. You read something and say, well, that doesn't make sense. How could that happen at this point? And then there are the little things that jump in, like, they ordered tea and then somebody at the table passed the water. You got to fix those kind of things too.
Well, and as you write, you're developing the story, but you're probably subtly changing things that you don't realize you've changed, which is what you were just saying. So you've got to go back and make sure that everything connects up.
Yeah, and it is the connecting up that's important. And sometimes you'll read it and you'll think, wait a minute, that's not very realistic. It's got to ring truer than that. And you'll fix some things about that particular scene. I had an interesting experience. You read all this advice about novels and thrillers, and you got to always ramp it up, and everything. So at one point in this, when it was much longer book than it needed to be, everyone they call it the indie, it's the Independence Retirement Community, but the indie book club members were dying off, and there were about 30 of them. And then suddenly there were hardly but a couple left. And, they had all been people that had been helping the professor with this book. And one of the reviewers, a local mystery writer, said, Landis, now look, you can't kill off everybody in the retirement community. And I said, yeah, you're right. So anyway, that chapter is no longer there. The indie book club is alive and well.
the regulators would be showing up saying, what is going on at this retirement community? Everyone is dying.
Exactly. And that was part of that little plot line. But see, it was one of those tangents that went way too far, right?
But you don't really know all of that until you get the book out. You have to write it all and then go back, like you said, and kind of work through some of those issues. And I also think your point about putting it aside for a little bit and coming back to it, I always do that with a lot of the reviews that I write or the roundups, because I feel like, right when you're in it, it all makes so much sense. But then you put it aside and you come back and you're like, oh, I don't like that sentence, or I've used that same word 4 times, or whatever it is. You just need a little bit of distance from it.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, you can sometimes, in my first book, I over-revised a page so much that when I went back and looked at it, I had revised it so much it was back to where it started, at which point I said, okay, this book's done.
You're like, okay, I need no more revising.
Exactly. But it is important, I think, for authors, first-time authors to realize that getting it down on paper, that first draft, is a great achievement, but it's also the start. A lot of authors find that they enjoy the rewriting process more. And I liken it to the fact that, you've got it looking pretty good, but then you go around and you really clean it up and make it better.
Yes, which definitely, I think, takes time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what do you hope your readers take away from the book?
So I hope they have a good time with the story, that they learn a little bit about North Carolina history, or at least the dispute related to North Carolina history, and that they have some maybe some connection to the theme that I spin out here with retirement community living, and how it's really not over yet. There's a lot of great experience in retirement communities, and people are, really want to live and use that experience. Why not use it to solve murders?
You talk a little bit about that in the afterword, that's one of the reasons you decided to set a book at a retirement community, is because sometimes people assume everybody there is walking with a cane or a walker, hobbling, but instead it's really usually a very vibrant community with a lot happening.
It really is. I mean, of course, there are facilities there for people if they have dementia or they're dealing with medical problems, but for the most part, I find that people in retirement communities in their Act 3, they're doing things. They're reading, they're going to lectures, they're studying or practicing arts that they never had time to practice in their minds when they were, in their careers. But they're also bringing that experience that they had from their careers to this community. And that's a wealth of experience. And so I tell people now, so, hey, if you got a great retirement community story, whether it's funny or poignant or just interesting, email me. If I use it in the next book, hey, I'll give you a shout out. I might even name a character after you.
That's very fun. So this is going to be a series.
Yeah, it's going to be a series. I'm actually exploring now. I'm in that research cogitating stage. And unfortunately, I don't have someone who's written a book for this next time period I'm focused on. But I'm not sure many people know that in the 1830s, Charlotte, North Carolina was sort of the center of the gold rush on the East Coast before they struck it big in California and everybody went out there to make their fortune. Charlotte was where the action was. They actually brought a U.S. Mint to Charlotte. The first branch of the U.S. Mint came to Charlotte in 1837. And so, there are still gold mine shafts under the big skyscrapers in Charlotte. I thought that might be a fun way to have a mystery.
I had no idea, and that is definitely fascinating.
Yeah. So we'll be exploring all of the, what the Cornish miners who came from overseas did in the mines, and maybe there's going to be a body or two buried down there, maybe some old gold coins. I hadn't really figured it all out yet. We're going to have fun with the retirement community amateur sleuths trying to solve a modern-day mystery that harkens back to the 1830s gold rush.
I love that, and I love that you are blending the contemporary storyline of these people at a retirement community with historical events and having them kind of unraveling them. It's a good combination.
Yeah, it's fun. I enjoy writing these characters. I don't want to leave them yet. I think there's still a lot. Craig Travail is still sort of a reluctant hero, even though he did survive the first the first book. And I'm just curious to see how he's going to continue to grow and what kind of trouble Yeager Alexander is going to get Travail and Harriet into.
Well, we all are going to look forward to that. Before we wrap up, will you let me know what books you have read recently that you really liked?
Sure. So I've been reading, as you know, a lot of books for the podcast. A couple of books I've read for the podcast that are coming out in the April, May, June time period. The Cicada Tree by Robert Gwaltney. It's a literary fiction set in the South. It's really a beautiful story. I've read Shadows Reel, a Joe Pickett novel by C.J. Box. It's the Wyoming game and fish warden who gets into a lot of scrapes. And interesting book, ArtCurious, Stories of the Unexpected, Slightly Odd, and Strangely Wonderful in Art History by Jennifer Dasal. That's coming out in April, and she's got a podcast that goes with that too. On the mystery front, I've read, I'm trying to read more mysteries since I'm writing mysteries in this year, and I went back and read Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, which I really commend to folks. 10 people end up on a island, and they all start dying, and you can't tell who's killing who. Walter Mosley's Devil in a Blue Dress, I enjoyed that. And I really loved, I listened to it on audiobook, The Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman. And I'd heard about it after I wrote my book. Somebody recommended it to me. It's set in a London pensioner retirement community. The protagonists are 4 members, retirees of the Thursday Murder Club, and they have a good time solving mysteries. She's done a great job with it. I'm now reading Rosalind Stopp's A Beginner's Guide to Murder, because that was another book recommended to me about older folks solving mysteries. And so those have been keeping me busy.
The only one I'm not familiar with is the last one, so I'm going to have to go look that up. But yeah, there's going to be this whole genre of people solving mysteries at retirement communities.
Exactly. And I'm reading them just to see what other people are doing. I'm sticking with my approach and my characters, but it's always fun to find out what kind of spin other authors are putting on, the retirement community amateur sleuths.
Absolutely. Right. Just to see what else is out there. I really liked the Thursday Murder Club, but I loved the second one even more. The Man Who Died Twice. It's really good.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go get that one now. That's a great recommendation.
And Then There Were None is my favorite Agatha Christie. I just love that story. And I love all the people that have done their take on it as well.
Yeah. And I read the book. I went and found it on Netflix or Amazon, I don't know what, and watched the movie. That was fun too, to see how they turned it into a cinematic project.
One of the local theaters here in Houston has put that on various summers. They used to have what they called Summer Chills series, and they would put on a mystery or two. Mm-hmm. And that one was one they did several times. And it's such a fun one to watch on the stage.
I mean, it's so clever the way she did that story. It's not really like any of the other books that she's written, because it's not, nobody's left. Who could have been the murderer? It's kind of crazy.
It is kind of crazy. And Peter Swanson just did his take on it with 9 Lives. Have you read that one yet?
I have not. I'm going to write that down too.
Yeah, so that's a fun version. I mean, it's a little different because it's not all in one place, but he takes that as his inspiration.
Okay, great.
Well, Landis, thank you so much for coming on the Thoughts from a Page podcast. I had a ball when I was on your show, and I'm so happy you're now on mine.
Cindy, I love what you're doing. You've got a great reach for the podcast, and a super podcast voice to go with it.
Thank you. Well, I hope everybody gets to read Deadly Declarations and enjoys it as much as I did.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for listening to my podcast. If you like this episode, and I hope you did, please follow me on Instagram at Thoughts from a Page. Consider joining my Patreon group to access bonus content and support the podcast. Tell all of your friends about the show and rate it or subscribe to it wherever you listen to your podcasts. I would really appreciate it. The book discussed in this episode can be purchased at my bookshop storefront, and the link is in the show notes. I hope you'll tune in next time.
You might be surprised to know that not all serial killers are straight cisgender white men, and the victims of true crime are not a monolith either. She's Wendy and I'm Beth, and together we host Fruit Loops Serial Killers of Color, a true crime podcast.
Together we take deep dives into the true crime stories about marginalized and minoritized perps and victims that often go untold.
We also provide the context and nuance that these stories deserve. At Fruit Loops, we're serving up true crime with a side of history, society, culture, and some fun.
Listen to Fruit Loops Serial Killers of Color on Spotify, Google Play, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.